Sometimes in life you might have everything. A wealthy family filled with warmth, affection, and love. And from the outside you seem to have it all, wealth and a perfect life. But then suddenly something happens that shatters all those perceptions. In this video, we'll delve into the case of the Hargan family, a family that, to the outside world, seemed to have everything they could ever want. Their mother was amazing and kind. They lived in a large, luxurious house, and they appeared happy and fortunate. But the reality inside the house was far from the picture people had in their minds. One day, completely out of the blue, the boyfriend of the youngest daughter in the family called 911 and said that his girlfriend was in danger. The police arrived at the Hargan family's house and were met with a crime scene that appeared to be either a murder or a suicide. But upon closer investigation, they realized that certain aspects of the scene didn't quite add up, and the truth might be far, far different from the theories they had come up with. Stephen and Pamela Hargan had lived together in Texas for many years, but eventually separated due to marital differences. Their union produced three daughters, Megan, Ashley, and Helen. In 2017, Helen was 24 years old and had a 10-year age gap with her older sister Megan. Despite the separation, both Stephen and Pamela maintained very close relationships with their daughters, supporting them fully even into adulthood. Megan had married years earlier, and due to her husband's military job, had been living full-time with her 8-year-old daughter at her mother's house. Pamela always welcomed her daughters, and given the large 6-bedroom house, she allowed them to stay for long periods. Ashley, like Megan, had married and lived far from their mother in Pennsylvania with her husband. The youngest daughter, Helen, was 24 years old and held 2 bachelor's degrees, one in mathematics and the other in management. At that time, she had enrolled in a master's program at the University of Dallas but dropped out and returned to live with her mother. Helen had struggled with severe depression as a teenager, had a history of self-harm, and even an unsuccessful suicide attempt with pills. Although her condition had improved in adulthood, Ashley remarked that Helen often drank excessively and likely used drugs as well. Ashley recalled that when Helen was in college, she would often call her at night, intoxicated, and despite Ashley being 32 and having her own job and life, she would compassionately stay on the phone until Helen felt better. Pamela had noticed Helen's condition and wanted to buy her a separate house to help her become more independent. But there was a significant problem: Helen's boyfriend. Helen was in a relationship with a man older than her, named Carlos Gutierrez, and both her sisters and her mother believed that Carlos was an addict, negatively influencing Helen's life. They felt he had caused her to drop out of school and neglect her future. Pamela had promised Helen she would buy her a house, but had repeatedly argued with her, stating that she would never allow Carlos to live in the house. Helen would have to choose between Carlos or the house. In this situation, Carlos called the police in mid-July 2017, stating that he thought his girlfriend was in danger. At the same time, he immediately called Ashley and informed her that a shooting had occurred at her mother's house. Keep in mind that Ashley lived in a different city at this time. Carlos was miles away from his girlfriend's house. And Megan, Helen's daughter, and Pamela were all living under the same roof. The police arrived at Pamela's house, and after breaking down the door, they made their way through the living room and into the kitchen, where they found Pamela Hargan's lifeless body on the floor. She had been shot twice in the head, and her upper body was covered with a blanket. Even the small dog's bed was placed on top of her head. It was clear that whoever had killed Pamela did not want to see her face, which was why they had covered it. Pamela's phone was found next to her body, but there were no fingerprints on it. It was obvious that the killer had positioned the body in that way, and the phone had not been there before Pamela's death. The police continued up the stairs, and when they opened the door to Helen's room, they found her lifeless body in the bathroom. She had been thrown into the bathtub from behind, and a gun was found between her legs. The first theory that crossed both the police's minds and that of the family members was that the case was a murder-suicide. Helen had killed her mother and then committed suicide in the bathroom. The initial evidence inside the house seemed to support the murder-suicide theory. However, the police had another big clue that contradicted the evidence at the crime scene. When Carlos called 911, he said he had just been talking to his girlfriend on the phone to help her. This was the point where the police started to realize that maybe Carlos wasn't a bad person. Perhaps everything the Hargen family had said about him wasn't entirely true. In his 911 call, Carlos said, "Help, there's an emergency. My girlfriend is in danger. She's trapped, and her sister's acting really strange." Carlos and Helen had met when Carlos was 30 and Helen was 23. They both worked at the same restaurant during Helen's college years. Although they had only been together for a year, Carlos was truly in love with Helen. He had plans to propose to her once their situation improved, and they had moved into a house together. Carlos called Helen every day, more than anyone else, and cared for her deeply. In fact, on the night of the murder, he had spoken to her for 4 hours on the phone. When he called 911 and saw that they weren't taking his warning about Helen being in danger seriously, he pressed further, giving more information to the operator, and continued calling until he was sure the police had gone to check on her. Before suddenly cutting off the call, Helen had told Carlos, "I think my mom has been killed." Carlos had arrived in Texas 10 days before Helen's death, staying at a hotel for a few days to be with his girlfriend. Even though he knew Pamela had a large house, he didn't want to intrude. He thought that the Hargan family had no problem with him, but it became clear that they weren't eager to get close to him. A significant detail here is that before Helen's death, Carlos had no idea just how much the Hargan family despised him and didn't want him around. While everyone involved with the case was convinced that Helen had killed her mother and then committed suicide, the police started to notice that many of the pieces didn't fit together. First of all, aside from Pamela's phone, Helen's phone was also found at the crime scene. In the same bathroom where her body was discovered, the phone was sitting on the sink, and there wasn't a single trace of blood or fingerprints on it. The more puzzling detail was that there was no blood on the large gun found between Helen's legs, which was impossible. Why? Because when a shotgun is fired in a small space, the blood splatter should cover everything. The entire bathroom was covered in blood, except for the gun placed between Helen's legs and the phone on the sink. Additionally, the police found several torn cushions in the basement. The cushions had been slashed with a large kitchen knife, and the knife itself was also discovered in the basement. The detective handling the case believed that the killer had initially intended to use the knife to commit the murder, but ultimately chose the gun instead. Next to the knife and cushions was a bookshelf with photo albums. Out of curiosity, the detective pulled one of the albums out and found a piece of paper behind it. The paper was a photocopy of all of Pamela's bank account details, including account numbers and PINs. Pamela, as it turned out, was a very successful and wealthy woman. At this point in the investigation, the police didn't have a warrant to seize financial documents, so the detective placed the photocopy back where it was, but took a photo of it. A few days later, after they had obtained the necessary warrant, they returned to the basement to collect the documents for testing and investigation. But guess what? The papers were gone. The police were thoroughly confused and had no idea what was happening. 2 women from the Hargan family had been murdered, and Helen had definitely not committed suicide. They still had no clue who the killer might be. The Hargan sisters had lied about Carlos, and the reports about him didn't match up with the family statements. The only person who hadn't spoken to the police was Steve, the father of the family. The detectives approached Steve and asked him what he knew, and he told them that he had heard from Ashley that Carlos had called that night and said, "Megan has killed your mother." In other words, all the surviving family members had known from the beginning that Carlos had claimed Helen told him on the phone that Megan was the killer, but they stayed silent and said nothing. Carlos told the police that Helen had been crying on the phone, sobbing, saying she heard her mother dying. She told him that Megan had gone upstairs and informed her that she had killed their mother. Carlos urged Helen to leave the house as soon as possible to at least save herself, but Helen refused because her niece, Megan's child, was also in the house. Helen wanted to save the child first. The phone call ended abruptly, and Carlos sent her a message. He was deeply worried and kept checking on her. Eventually, just a few minutes after telling Carlos all this, Helen sent a message saying Carlos was still worried and kept calling Helen's phone over and over, but all his calls went unanswered. Then suddenly Megan answered the phone. Carlos insisted for a full 10 minutes that she give the phone to Helen, but Megan refused and simply said that their mother didn't approve of Helen's relationship with Carlos. Eventually, she hung up. An important point to note here is that the sisters had a very close relationship with Pamela. When Carlos told Ashley that Megan had killed their mother and Helen, Ashley clearly didn't believe him. Megan was their older sister, living with Pamela and Helen. She had always been close to them and supported them, so why would Carlos say Megan was the killer? Furthermore, Megan wasn't even at home that day. According to both Megan and Steve, she had gone to her father's house and wasn't with Pamela or Helen. That same night when the police were collecting evidence, they took a photo of Megan. On her hands, they noticed marks consistent with having recently fired a gun. This meant that the detectives were sure Megan had fired a weapon recently. They didn't know exactly when or where, but it was clear. On the other hand, by this point in the investigation, it was clear that Helen had not committed suicide, because the bullet entry point on her body showed that a suicide in that manner was impossible. Now, it looked like there were two murder cases, and the killer was still out there, free. So far, Megan had spoken to the police several times and even offered to come in and help. With the contradictions piling up, the police decided to bring Megan in and confront her with the conflicting evidence. When Megan realized she was being treated as a suspect, she said, "I gave you my clothes, I registered my fingerprints, and I've told you everything you wanted. Do you think a guilty person would do all that?" In her statements, Megan blamed Helen, saying that Helen's behavior had changed in the past few months, and this had led to a murder-suicide. When the police asked her about small details, she became very angry. Suddenly, she mentioned that shortly before the murders, her mother had told her to call the police because two suspicious men were lurking around their street. Megan was the only one who had seen these men and reported them to the police. At the same time, the police learned that someone had tried to withdraw $400,000 from Pamela's bank account, both the day before and the day of the murders. Pamela had noticed this and immediately contacted the bank to freeze her account and prevent any further withdrawals. She even sent Megan to the bank to ensure the account was secure. After hearing Megan's statement, the police finally told her that Carlos had claimed she was the killer. Megan was shocked and asked, "Why? How?" The police explained that Helen had told Carlos over the phone. Megan immediately responded, "If Helen had told him that, I would have heard it. I was downstairs." The police asked, "But you weren't even at home at that time. How could you have heard it?" At that point, Megan couldn't create a consistent story for the police and ultimately confessed that she was the one who had tried to withdraw the $400,000 from Pamela's account. She said that she wanted to buy a house with that money and was looking for a completely separate home for herself. While confessing, she repeatedly insisted that despite all of this, she was not the killer and hadn't harmed Pamela or Helen. Throughout the interrogation, the police repeatedly tried to get a confession from Megan, but she persisted in claiming her innocence. Even though it was clear she was lying about many parts of the case, she refused to admit to the murders and said, "Fine, blame me, judge me, let my daughter grow up without a mother." Eventually, the interrogation ended, and since no confession had been made and there was no direct evidence, they released Megan. After this, Megan took out a large loan, rented a house in West Virginia, completely left Texas, enrolled her child in a new school, regularly attended church, and her husband returned from his mission. The police didn't give up, though, and continued to keep her under surveillance, waiting for the results of all the tests related to the case. This process took a year and 4 months. Finally, the police gathered all the evidence they needed and were ready to issue an arrest warrant for Megan. One day, as Megan was dropping her child off at school, she was arrested on her way back home. The officers who arrested her said that when they looked into Megan's eyes, there was nothing there. No sadness, no shame, no regret, nothing. All the evidence was against Megan, but she still insisted that it was all Helen's fault. She kept repeating that Helen had been depressed, self-harming, and wanted to kill herself. She said that Helen had killed their mother because Pamela had refused to buy a house for her, which made the daughter angry. Do you know what lie was uncovered after Megan's arrest? That in reality, Pamela had never opposed her daughter's relationship with Carlos. There had been no argument about Carlos not living in a house that Pamela had bought, and all the things that Megan and Ashley had told the police about Carlos were pure lies. Megan had said that Carlos was a drug addict, that he beat Helen, and that he was a criminal. In court, it was revealed that Carlos had never used drugs, was deeply in love with Helen, and was an emotional person. Carlos firmly stated in court that his girlfriend was hopeful about the future and would never have committed suicide. She had definitely been murdered. In court, he just quietly shed tears, staring at Megan. On the other hand, their middle sister, Ashley, initially defended Megan, but when she saw the police evidence and listened to Carlos's statements, she agreed to testify against Megan in court. Ashley, who was 8 months pregnant with her first child, tried her best to remain calm while testifying. She spoke assertively and was strong, but when photos of the autopsies of her mother and sister were shown, she broke down in tears and couldn't continue. In one day, her once happy and close-knit family had been destroyed, and the killer was her own sister. Megan's lawyers continued to argue that it was a murder-suicide case. When the coroner explained for several hours that based on the location of Helen's gunshot wound, it was impossible for her to have committed suicide with a shotgun, they still insisted that Helen had sat on the toilet, bent over, placed her head on the gun, and pulled the trigger with her toes. No matter how much the prosecutor asked, why wasn't the gun covered in blood? Why was the body thrown into the bathtub? Why was the phone so clean? They had no answers. The jury heard the entire defense, and on Thursday, March 24th, 2022, Megan Hargan was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, Pamela and Helen. But the trial wasn't over because one of the jurors still had doubts that Helen could have really committed suicide by pulling the trigger with her toe. This one person single-handedly delayed the final verdict for a year. In September 2023, a new jury was selected to re-examine all the trial steps. This meant the witnesses had to testify again, and all the pressure and intensity of the trial environment were relived. Ultimately, the second jury found Megan guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Megan Hargan to 2 consecutive life sentences, meaning she would never be released from prison. Megan's 8-year-old child was extremely close to her grandmother. The child spent most of the day with Pamela and loved Helen dearly. This child lost her entire family, and when her mother was arrested, no one told her where Megan was, why she was gone, or how her family had fallen apart. After Megan's arrest, her husband didn't allow Ashley and Steve to see the child ever again and completely cut off all contact with them. Thank you for staying with me through this video. If you haven't liked it yet, don't forget to hit the like button, and I'll see you in another video in another criminal case. Goodbye.